Hey folks, I'm Isaac. In this video, we're going to be making the Packable Poncho Kit. A waterproof, lightweight layer that's always there when you need it. Let's get into it. What you're going to need for this kit will be your scissors, thread snips, marking device, a lighter, and clips. And a few things that might make your life a little bit easier will be tweezers and some kind of bodkin, whether that's this type of bodkin or a safety pin. This kit has a few more pieces than what you may be used to, so with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and label each of them so that you know which one is which going forward. There are 5 total pattern pieces in this kit, and the first 3 are going to make up the hood assembly once they're sewn together. These are the hood sides, which you will have 2 of, the hood gusset, which is 1 rectangle, and this funny looking piece is the hood drawstring facing, which you will also have 1 of. The biggest piece in your kit is going to be the poncho body. This will have a hole cut out in the middle, which will be where your hood assembly attaches to. The next smallest rectangle is going to be for your stuff sack. And then you'll have some grosgrain, some 1mm cordage for the drawstring on your hood, as well as the stuff sack. And then you'll have 2 micro cord locks. Before we get started, we're going to want to make sure that our machine is set up correctly. Make sure that you have a fresh bobbin and that your machine is threaded correctly. Check your needle to make sure it's nice and sharp and fresh. You also want to make sure that your tension is correct for a light, slippery fabric. The fabric we chose for this kit is 1.1 Silnylon. Since this kit will spend most of its time as a worn garment, we felt that the marginal stretch of Silnylon was outweighed by its durability. In the event that you choose to use this as shelter, it will still keep you nice and dry because of the silicone impregnation, while still being pretty freaking lightweight. When I made the prototype for this kit, mine weighed in at just under 8 ounces. First, we're going to work on putting together the hood assembly. We're going to do this by taking one of the hood sides in the hood gusset and sewing them together with a straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Using clips here would be a great idea because this fabric is pretty slick. However, you just want to make sure you don't use pins because then you'll make holes. Since this is waterproof, we don't want that. The other thing to note is that this fabric doesn't have a face or a back. So at this point in time, don't worry about lining up the front and back with all of your pieces. Your hood gusset goes in between the 2 hood sides. So we're going to start at the top and we'll clip it in place and just move it around the curve and clip it in place as you go. One thing to note before we get started is when we're sewing circles or large curves, I like to make sure that my larger pattern piece is on the bottom so that you have the smaller pattern piece on top and you can maneuver it around those curves just a little bit better. Take your other hood side and lay it down, and we're going to clip the hood gusset and the other hood side that we just sewed together on top of that. Keep in mind, this may be a little confusing, but we're sewing the hood gusset to the hood side still. So we're taking the hood gusset to be our smaller pattern piece, and it's going to be on top of our hood side, which is the larger pattern piece. We're going to do the same thing here, so straight stitch and 1/4 inch seam allowance. Little pro tip for the curves, just make sure that your 2 pattern pieces are lined up on top of each other so that you get both layers in your stitch, and just take your time, it'll turn out fine. At this point in the process, your pattern pieces should look like this. With the 2 hood sides sewn to the hood gusset, the front of the pattern pieces should line up here. Next, we're going to go ahead and sew that together with a straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. want to give you a little more perspective on our construction method here. Since we're using a French seam, what you're looking at when you finish the hood assembly right here is actually the outside or the right side of the fabric. Now, if this is a little confusing, we're going to go over that in more detail in the next step. Using a French seam is a great choice because it promotes durability, improves the waterproofness, and it covers the raw edges. It's constructed by sewing the wrong sides together, turning your seam right side in, and then sewing over that seam again with a larger seam allowance to encase that raw edge. I'm going to show you how to sew this French seam with some scrap fabric that I have here because it's easiest to see how this is done with pieces of fabric that have a distinct front and back. The scraps I have here are VX15 and some 6.5 ounce melange woven with Dyneema. We'll go over the basics for the French seam here, and then I'll give you tips for the more intricate parts of the pattern later on. For this demonstration, I want you to take note of the two distinct fronts and backs of these fabrics. For the melange, we have the heathered purple printed front, and the X-Pack, we have the olive green front. On the backs, we have a coated slightly pink, and for the X-Pack, we have the white taffeta backing. We'll start by putting these two pieces of fabric together, back to back, and sewing a straight stitch with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After you've run that first straight stitch, you're just going to go ahead and open up those two pieces of fabric and fold them over so that they're face to face. Once you've opened that up, you'll see the fold of your seam right there, and we're going to do the same straight stitch but outside of that seam allowance that we just did. So we're going to use about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I've sewn half of this to demonstrate what your seam is going to look like once you finish. So we've got this with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to open that back up and it becomes the inside of your pattern piece. You can tell here that our raw edge is encapsulated inside of this seam. If you look at the top, this is what we are trying to cover up. You'll know that you've done this correctly when you see no raw edge on the outside, no raw edge on the inside, and this flap right here will be your seam allowance. Now that we've got the basics of this stitch down, we're going to move back over to our hood assembly. Keep in mind that this sil poly is very different weight than what we just showed you in the demonstration, so it's going to act differently. It's going to be slippery, and that raw edge might poke out a little bit if you're not careful. So just take your time, be patient, and make sure you encapsulate it all the way around. Go ahead and flip your hood inside out. Then start at one of the sides where the hood gusset meets the hood side. We're going to pull together the two pattern pieces, and we'll clip that in place, making sure that you cover your seam allowance. The goal here is to make sure that you encapsulate that raw edge entirely in that last seam, but as you can see here, I missed it by just a little bit on a few parts of the seam. It's okay, we just recommend trimming that down as close as possible and then treating it with some kind of waterproofing agent like Seam Grip or Silnet. We're going to repeat those same steps on the remaining two seams on the hood assembly. After this step, all three of the seams on your hood assembly should be finished with the French seam, but we're going to set that aside so that we can prep our hood drawstring facing. There are two things that we need to do to the drawstring channel facing to prep it to attach to the hood assembly. First, we're going to fold it in half, and we're going to mark the center point on both sides of this fold. Second, we're going to come down to the short edge of the hood channel facing, and we're going to use a straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew those together. Now that we've prepped our drawstring channel facing, we're going to set that aside and go back to our hood assembly once more. On our hood assembly, we're going to prep for the buttonhole. We're going to go to the left. In my case, you can also choose the right. We're going to go to the left of the center seam about 2.5 inches, and then we're going to go down from the raw edge about 1/2 inch. Now this placement is pretty important because you want to make sure that your buttonhole is inside the drawstring channel, but also not so close that it's outside of your seam allowance. In our Packable Poncho kit, you have the option of using a buttonhole for the drawstring channel. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that right now. If your machine doesn't have a buttonhole, then you have other options. You can get some kind of grommet plier kit such as this one, or a setting kit like this, but the important thing is that you look for a small grommet or eyelet, probably about 5.1 millimeters. The first step for this buttonhole is going to be to mark the placement, and we're going to use an extra scrap of fabric such as this small rectangle to reinforce that area and make sure that our buttonhole holds in place. One of the most important things to do for the buttonhole is to make sure that your machine is set up correctly. Each machine will most likely do this differently, so ensure that you check your owner's manual to make sure that you're doing it properly. For this specific machine, which is the Singer Heavy Duty 4411, there are 3 specific settings for the buttonhole. 2 of them will be for the top and bottom, 1 is for the left and 1 is for the right. Additionally, we have a separate foot that we have to change out for the buttonhole. Some machines allow you to electronically change the width and length of the buttonhole. However, on this machine, we have a set width, so I'm going to aim to make it no longer than 1 inch long. If you feel uncomfortable with this at all, just make sure that you do some test buttonholes on other scrap pieces of fabric to make sure you know what you're doing before you get onto your final pattern. Last thing to note before we get onto this buttonhole is to make sure that you're only sewing through one hood side of your hood assembly. That way you make sure that you don't sew it together. After finishing up that stitch, your buttonhole should look something like this. To finish up this buttonhole, we're going to trim down our reinforcement piece, and then we're also going to open up the buttonhole itself. However, since our buttonhole in this case is so short, we're just going to use the thread snips to cut that fabric in between. Okay, let's put our machine back onto a straight stitch and get back to the kit. Now that we've finished our buttonhole, we're going to grab our hood assembly and we're going to baste the drawstring channel facing onto it. To position our drawstring channel facing onto the hood assembly, we're going to turn the hood assembly right side out, and then we're going to leave the drawstring channel assembly inside out. Using the center marks that we made earlier on our drawstring channel facing, we're going to go ahead and place that on top of our hood assembly, making sure that those lines and curves line up with one another. You'll know you've done this right when you have the center front seams of both the hood assembly and the drawstring channel facing lined up with each other. After clipping this in place, you're going to sew it down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and just make sure that you don't sew both sides together. To finish off our drawstring channel facing, we're going to flip the whole hood assembly inside out. We're going to fold that facing to the inside, roll out that seam, and clip it down in place. The final step to finish off the hood assembly is, after clipping that in place, we're going to run a straight stitch about 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge of the drawstring channel facing all the way around the circumference of the hood. After you finish that straight stitch, you have completed the hood assembly. This is huge. You're halfway there. Keep going. As you can see, we've moved into the makerspace to explain this next step. It's much easier to show this with the poncho body laid out flat on a large surface. Now that we have our poncho body laid out, we need to identify the front and back of our poncho. Now, I'm not talking about the right and wrong sides because, as I said earlier, the Silnylon doesn't have a right or wrong side. The center front of our poncho body is going to be the shorter side, and you can tell that by when you have your poncho body laid out, the hole is going to be offset to one side or the other. Whichever one is closer to the edge, that's the center front. And one more thing, we don't have special tape or anything. Nothing really sticks to Silnylon because of the coating. Just use what you can. You only need it for a short time as you're sewing to remind you of which side is which. With your hood assembly inside out, we're going to place it into the hole in the center of the poncho body, with the front of the hood assembly facing center front of your poncho body. Make sure that you line up the seam on the front of the hood assembly with the mark that you've made on the center front of your poncho body, and the same for the back. Just remember that the most important thing in this step is that your wrong sides are together and that your hood assembly is facing the correct direction. Now, if you haven't already picked up on this, we're going to be using a French seam once again for the hood assembly. So we're going to head back over to the sewing machine and sew it down. To finish up this French seam, we're going to reach our hand into the hood assembly, pull it so that it is inside out. We're going to press our seams, clip them in place, and finish that up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the circumference of the hood assembly. After that last stitch, your final French seam should look something like this. To make this poncho into a tarp, you're going to need to add tie-outs. Now, this is important to know now because you're going to need to prep the grosgrain that we include in your kit before you sew them into the rolled hem around the edges. We include about 36 inches of grosgrain in this kit, so you can make as many as 8 and as few as 4 tie-outs. I said that wrong. We're just prepping the grosgrain now because you're going to need to slide the grosgrain into the rolled hem as you're sewing it down. I would recommend cutting about 4-inch pieces and cut as many as you plan on using. Okay, I know this kit has been fairly long so far, but get a snack or a drink, stick with me, we're almost there. Our next step is going to be to sew a 1/2 inch rolled hem around the entire perimeter of the poncho body. To create a rolled hem, you're going to fold the fabric over twice so that the raw edge is covered, then run a straight stitch all the way. As always, make sure that you're folding your rolled hem to the inside of your project so that that raw edge is on the bottom side and you don't see it. There's a couple ways to do this. The first option is to measure out your 1/2 inch rolled hem, clip the whole way, and then sew. The other option is to start at the beginning, measure, clip, and then start sewing and fold as you go. Don't forget that you need to include your tie-out points in your rolled hem. So first thing that you need to do is go ahead and fold your poncho body in half and mark those points where you're going to include your tie-out points. I would recommend clipping these in place so that you don't forget to sew them in when you're doing your rolled hem. These tie-outs are shaped like a V and inserted into the rolled hem to disperse some of the load across more fabric and hopefully reduce tear-outs over time. Now you'll notice that the tie-out is facing the inside or the main portion of the poncho body. We'll finish this up in the next step by folding them over the rolled hem and then using a reinforcing stitch to finish them up. Don't worry about embedding your corner tie-out points. We're going to finish those up after we've completed the rolled hem around the perimeter of the poncho body. These are the last stitches of the kit. We're almost there. The corner tie-outs are going to be similar to the midpoint tie-outs, but we're going to just tack them down onto the top of the rolled hem and make sure that you go back and forth a few times to lock them in place. Our center tie-out points are currently facing the inside of our poncho body, so we're just going to fold those over and do a few back and forth stitches to reinforce those in place. On to the finishing touches. We're going to cut about 32 inches of the included cord in the kit. We'll slide that into the drawstring channel using either the bodkin or a safety pin. Then once you've done that, we're going to burn the edges, install our cord lock, and tie an overhand knot in the end. As always, trim the loose ends, burn your edges, and make it look good so that you look so fresh and so clean. The last step is going to be to make your stuff sack kit. Now we're not going to show you how to make that right here, but you can check out our DIY stuff sack kit video linked in the description below. That's it. Congratulations on finishing your very own packable poncho kit. If you'd like more travel-inspired MYOG fun, check out our DIY packing cube kits. Take some pictures along the way, and as always, make sure you tag us on Instagram. Thanks for watching.